This is my flooded 1975 Camaro that I'm rebuilding to give to my mom, and also use as an opportunity to learn how to work on cars. Now, I thought that I was done working on the engine, but after getting it down to Florida and getting it started again for the first time, I noticed that the engine has a horrible knocking noise. Originally, I thought this noise was rod knock, then I thought it might be the fuel pump, and in the last video, that's where I left you guys off, was replacing the fuel pump. So did replacing the fuel pump fix the problem? Let's listen and find out. Now, it's hard to tell over the sound of that loud exhaust, but no, it did not fix the problem. But before we go pulling the engine out to check for rod knock, I have one more simple solution that might fix this. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why is the transmission not inside the car? Well, in my defense, this was a lot simpler than pulling the whole engine out. Now, the reason that I needed to pull the transmission out was because I needed access to this bad boy, the flex plate that was bolted to the back of the engine. Because I believe that the flex plate is not perfectly flat, and as it's rotating at thousands of RPM, it's actually clanging around inside there and making that banging noise. So, the perfect way to test if a flex plate is flat is to put it on top of another flat surface. And thankfully, my other flat surface that I have is a second flex plate. Now, what you're hearing here is the sound of the original flex plate wobbling around on top of the new, perfectly flat flex plate. And these clanging noises prove that the original one was not completely flat, which confirms my theory that this one was not within spec. So we're gonna go ahead and put the new one on and see if that helps our problem. So we got a new flex plate, we got new bolts, we got new everything that's gonna help this go back onto the engine, and then we'll get the transmission hooked back up again, and hopefully that will be the fix of our knocking problem. Now, unfortunately, if that doesn't fix the problem, it's rod knock, and we're gonna be completely screwed here because that means we gotta pull the whole engine back out after all of this work has been done. But I don't want to think about that right now because that would be a huge amount of effort to get that fixed. So for now, let's get the new flex plate put on there, bolt it up, and hopefully, fingers crossed, that will finally be the fix for our problem. Now, unfortunately, this is how I find out that I don't own a single 12-point socket, and it is because these new ARP bolts for the flex plate require a 12-point. So off to the store I go, and I'll be back in a moment. So after getting our 12-point socket, we're back under the car, lubing up the new ARP bolts and getting them in by hand. That beautiful new flex plate is already on there, and we're just getting it bolted on now. Now, the hardest part of this project was getting the transmission in and out from underneath the car. For anyone who's been watching the series a long time, you know that the first transmission install was a huge pain, and this time was no easier. Even though I had done it before, it's still a very complicated process. So with the bolts finger tight on there, it was time to start torquing them down to spec. Now, this time I decided to do it in 2 stages. So the first step was going to 45 foot-pounds in a star pattern, and then we were going to go all the way up to the 80 foot-pounds that is recommended with these ARP bolts. And to keep the engine from turning as we tighten everything down here, I just have a pry bar locked in behind the flex plate up underneath the actual block of the engine that keeps everything from spinning. So with the flex plate fully installed, it's time to put the transmission back up against the block and get it bolted in. Now, like I said, this process was still much more complicated than it should have been, and I actually dropped the transmission off of the jack at one point here. But thankfully nothing broke, and I was able to get it back on the jack, put up into place, and finally bolted back up to the car. And then with the transmission back in, it was time to put the transmission brace back on, and that is the final piece that we need to get this thing testable again. I'm not going to reconnect the actual flex plate to the torque converter because I want to make sure that it's easy to take this thing back off if we have to do that. So we got the new flex plate installed finally, and I just went to test the engine to crank it over, and our battery's dead. Turns out, during all of our testing with the engine, I left the ignition turned on for basically the last week while I was getting this fixed. Which means our battery is now sitting at a very nice 1.2 volts. And that, unfortunately, is not going to crank any engine over. So I've got the jump pack charging up again, so we can jump the battery and get the engine cranking. And once that's done, we should be able to get the engine to turn over, and we'll see if our knocking noise is fixed. Now, I haven't hooked the transmission 100% back to the engine. The actual torque converter is not bolted to the flex plate right now because I just want to run it. And if the clanging is still happening, I want to be able to pull the engine out without having to take the whole transmission out again. So the less bolts attached right now, the better. And now we just have to wait until our jump pack is done charging. All right, this is the first test with the new flex plate. I am very nervous on whether or not this is going to work. I'm literally shaking because if this isn't the fix, we're in big trouble. Well, it tried to start, but I still don't have enough juice in the battery, so we're gonna have to let it charge a little bit longer, and hopefully that starts it. And with the glorious sound of the engine rumbling through the garage, this is the comparison of what it was before and after. So the banging sound is gone for now, but we can't be 100% sure that it's fixed until we get the transmission fully hooked back up. But we can't run the engine with the transmission hooked up until the transmission is full of fluid again, and we can't fill it up with fluid until the drive shaft and the cooling lines are back on. So that's where we need to start, is putting the cooling lines back on the transmission and putting the drive shaft back in. So let's get to it. So with our task list set out in front of us, we headed back underneath the car to attach the drive shaft again. Now this is a very easy part to put back in place, especially compared to completely taking the transmission out and putting it back in again. This was literally 4 bolts and it is back on and ready to be used. Next, we wiggled over to the transmission cooler lines to get those hooked up. This was a much easier process since the lines were already bent and had been previously hooked up to the transmission. So getting them back into place and screwed in was much easier this time. So this whole process went by super fast, and then all we had to do was fill it back up with transmission fluid, and we were ready to run this again for the first time, totally hooked back up. Now, as it was running, I started to realize that even with the flex plate properly fixed again, it was still not running as smoothly as it should be. And I only know this because I've listened to a bunch of other 350s running on the internet, and I know that this doesn't sound quite right. And even my dad, who used to work on engines all the time, agreed with me as well that this wasn't sounding exactly as it should. So we decided that the best course of action was to try and time the engine again. Now, when I originally built this, I tried to check the timing, and I figured that it was probably about maybe 12 to 10 degrees advanced. However, whenever I tried to check it with my timing gun, I could never see the lines coming around and intersecting to tell me where the actual timing was set. Now, I always chalked this up to having a cheap timing gun, and that was the problem, and maybe when I got to Florida, I could check with a better timing gun. Now, that being said, I was completely wrong, and as we checked the timing on this, we realized that the reason that I could never see the line coming around was because the timing was set to about 30 degrees advanced. Now, that is not good. That is ridiculously advanced timing, which means we're probably getting knocking from pre-ignition or even detonation, which is not good in a brand new engine or any engine for that matter. So we slowly brought the timing back further and further and further until we could see that line coming around, and we got this properly set at 14 degrees advanced, and now it sounds unbelievably good. So now that we have our engine 100% tuned in, it's time to get some new wheels and tires on this baby so we can take it for our second first drive. Now, I would love to show you the brand new tires. I really would. But unfortunately, as we were installing the new ones, we realized that these studs on the rear tires were way too short to fit the new setup. So for now, I have to leave you with the cliffhanger until we get these studs replaced, which means I first need to show you getting the studs out. Now, getting the studs out is not as hard as I thought it was going to be. It just takes a little bit of heat, a little bit of hammering, and then a lot of it of big hammering. And those studs popped out really quick. And with all 10 studs out, we can see how many different types of studs that are here. Some are short, some are long, but every single one of them is too short for the new rims to fit properly on these new disc converted brakes. So one trip to the store later and we had 10 new wheel studs. Now these get inserted from the back. I used 2 nuts to space them and then the lug nut going on the top. Now these are the old lug nuts, not the new ones, so in case we destroy one, which we destroyed 3 in this process, it wouldn't damage the new ones at all. So with our spacers on and our lug nut on, we use the impact wrench to tighten everything down and pull that wheel stud through from the back. And now we just need to do that 4 more times. Now with the wheel studs all properly installed, it's time to put our disc brakes back on the rear axle here. Now this is a pretty easy process. Put the caliper back on, put the brake pads back in, bolt everything down together, and then pop the wheel on. But obviously I can't show you guys the wheels just in this random clip, so enjoy this little cinematic of our new wheels and tires. Now, as cool as those wheels look, we have one final piece to connect before we can get this thing driving again, and oh boy, do I want to get this thing out on the road. And that final piece is the transmission shifter cable, and as much as I would love to deliver some good news, as per usual, I've only got bad. So in my ever ongoing fight of battling the old parts that were used to quote-unquote repair this car, I'm now finding out that the shifter cable, which is this black part right there that's going in and out and has a ton of slop in it, has been improperly replaced with the shifter cable from a truck. Now this is the shifter pin that is supposed to connect to the bottom of that shift cable and allows the cable to actually control the transmission. This little tiny piece right there is what is supposed to go inside the shifter cable to make sure it hooks into everything. Now if I head underneath the car, this is the other end of the shifter cable. This huge hole right here is what is supposed to have that little pin go through it, and obviously this is much bigger than the pin is, and therefore it can't control the shifter. Now this side here on the transmission where this bracket is perfectly fine. It goes through all the gears the way it's supposed to, but unfortunately this cable here is probably going to need to be replaced if I'm going to get this thing to shift accurately and smoothly. So another huge amount of progress this video, but again, something comes up that stops the progress as usual, which means we're gonna have to put in some more parts orders, get some more things to get that shifter working again, probably take the entire shifter apart and refurbish it anyway, but it's just very frustrating to get this close to being able to literally drive this car around with full mechanical capability and be stopped by something as stupid as a shift cable. But I don't want to leave you guys hanging without a video for too long, so I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya!